Welcome to Chapter 23, Part 2. In this section, we're going to pick up our bacterial diseases with Lyme disease. Then we're going to talk about viral diseases, protozoan diseases, and Helminthic diseases. Lyme disease is a tick-borne illness that usually circulates between deer and mice. What happens is baby ticks like to feed on mice. So the tick nymphs live on mice, infect them with this gram-negative spirochete called Borrelia burgdorferi, and it replicates within the mice and infect the nymphs. There's a common cycle of infection. Then as the ticks mature, they switch from feeding on mice to feeding on deer. So they jump on to an adult deer, bite them, infect the deer with the Borrelia, and another tick bites the deer, picks up the Borrelia. The spirochetes end up in the eggs, so you have infected nymphs growing and infecting mice. And so it goes from tick to mouse, back to uninfected ticks, to deer, to uninfected ticks, to tick nymphs, and it circles around and around. What happens though is when the ticks bite us, and we become kind of a dead end for the disease organism, but it still causes rather severe disease in humans. Now, spirochetes have a tendency to progress in stages as far as the disease because they go into hiding. So when you are initially infected, we call this phase 1, there's often this characteristic bullseye rash at the site of the tick bite. There's flu-like symptoms, you don't feel good, malaise, muscle ache, fever, usually goes away in a couple of weeks. If we treat you with antibiotics at this stage, usually you're completely cured of the disease and you go on. But the spirochetes, after the initial phase, go into hiding. They hide from the immune system, slowly spread. Then we go into phase 2, which in the absence of effective treatment can affect the heart. You can have irregular heartbeat to the point where you need a pacemaker. Also, you can have neurological symptoms. You can have facial paralysis, memory loss, other neurological symptoms, up to and including meningitis and encephalitis. Now, you usually recover from these even without treatment. If you do get antibiotics at this stage, it's much harder to get rid of the Borrelia because it's in so many tissues at this point. But then your immune system wins. They go back into hiding, hide from your immune system, and you get into stage 3. Stage 3 is usually arthritis symptoms. We think it's because they're lodging in the joints, and you have long-term arthritis caused by this infectious agent. If we try to treat you with antibiotics at this stage, it's very, very difficult to get rid of the pathogen. So, keep an eye out for ticks. Make sure you use all of the preventative measures you from getting bit by ticks. Usually if you wear light clothing, for whatever reason, ticks like dark clothing, wear insect repellent, and check for ticks after being out in the woods where there's a possibility of having deer or mice around. If you are bit by a tick, make sure that you go in, get treated, because as I mentioned during the disease progression description, if we can treat you in phase 1, then the disease is cleared out and you never go on to phase 2 or phase 3. You really don't want to go on to phase 2 or phase 3. Now, Lyme disease is more common in the northeastern part of the United States simply because there's more forest and trees closer to where people are living, so you have more contact with ticks. Epidemic typhus is a disease that's been long associated with two things: wars and unsanitary conditions. Generally speaking, if you're in a war, you're in unsanitary conditions. It's caused by a gram-negative bacterium in the Rickettsia genus, and it's passed by lice. Here's a lovely picture of human body louse. What happens is the rickettsia organism multiplies in the gut of the louse, comes out in the feces, gets into the human bloodstream when the person scratches the bite and causes the feces to get into the bloodstream. There, the rickettsia replicates within the human host. The first symptom is a prolonged fever, usually around the lines of about 2 weeks. Then from there it can progress into a rash because the rickettsia likes to replicate in the lining of the capillaries, and this causes small breaks in the capillaries. That's what causes the rash. If it progresses, it can lead to a hemorrhagic disease in which the patient bleeds out. Now, we generally don't see typhus, epidemic typhus, around very often, but on a historical note, they think that typhus is what actually defeated Napoleon's army when they were marching on Russia in 1812. It's been said that the cold Russian winter and the Russians' burned earth policy actually defeated Napoleon's army, caused them to come back, but their ranks were already decimated by typhus, and it's because all the soldiers were covered in body lice. And when somebody would get sick or they were sleeping next to somebody, the lice would jump to somebody else and spread the disease within the close packed ranks. Interesting little side note, something to remember and make sure that you appreciate modern sanitary facilities that lead to us not commonly associating with body lice. Now, in this next section, we're going to talk about viral diseases, and I'm going to focus mainly on infectious mononucleosis and hemorrhagic fevers. Hemorrhagic fevers have become more common recently, and so I'm going to be mentioning some of those that are of historical significance as well as those that are new and emerging. But before we go on, you can pause and appreciate a little bit of dark humor. Infectious mononucleosis, or mono as it's more commonly called, is caused mainly by 2 herpes family viruses. Epstein-Barr virus, EBV, is the most common cause, and as you can see from this chart, most of us by the time we've reached our 20s have developed antibodies to EBV. Most of us pick it up in our childhood. It's spread by salivary secretions and passes from person to person. The initial illness, if you get it when you're younger, is a very mild disease. Oftentimes you don't realize you've got it. Can be subclinical, or it can be mild flu-like symptoms. If you get it when you're older, you get the classic mono symptoms, which is fever, sore throat, swollen lymph nodes in the neck. Oftentimes people have severe tiredness associated with this, and most of the time after that you get better. Well, the problem with herpes family viruses is once you have them, they're always there. You get the initial illness. In this case, they're circulating in the bloodstream, and then they go into hiding. They go into latency, and your immune system doesn't notice them. Now, if they stay in latency, that's not a problem. The problem is when they reactivate. If you become stressed, your immune system drops. There's a number of different triggers. EBV can come out of latency where they've been in the B cells and cause a new round of mono. Also, another problem is you're more likely to have it reactivate if you get mono in your teenage or later years, when we call it the kissing disease, which is how most of us get it, and you're more likely to have it reactivate. If you get it in your single-digit years, when you're getting it from drinking from each other's cups or whatever, or playing spin the bottle, then it's less likely to reactivate. That's the normal progression of the disease. EBV has also been associated with some types of cancer in Africa. We think that it may be causing cancer when it's in people that have also been infected with malaria, but we haven't quite figured out Burkitt's lymphoma quite yet. Now, the second most common cause of infectious mononucleosis is caused by CMV, also a herpes family virus, gets passed the same way as EBV, usually causes a milder disease, but it also reactivates. Now, if you get CMV, cytomegalovirus, for the first time when you're pregnant in your first trimester, it can cause rubella-like birth defects in the fetus. Now that we have a vaccine for rubella, CMV has moved up as the most common infectious cause of birth defects. For that reason, we're working on a vaccine for that. We have a hard time making vaccines for herpes viruses. We've had success with the varicella zoster virus, the chickenpox virus, and so there's hope that soon we will have vaccines for EBV and CMV. Now, the third most common cause of infectious mononucleosis, toxoplasmosis, is caused by a protozoa, and we're not going to talk about that one. Now on to hemorrhagic fevers. Hemorrhagic fevers are those types of fevers that can cause hemorrhages, which causes the death of the patient. Now, there are two classic hemorrhagic fevers. Those are those that we've had around for a long time, and then we have some emerging hemorrhagic fevers. So let's talk about the classic ones first. Yellow fever. Yellow fever is caused by an arbovirus, and it is transmitted by mosquitoes. We usually think of yellow fever as infecting those in Central and South America, but it actually was a problem in the United States for quite a long time until we were able to get rid of the mosquitoes that carried yellow fever. The natural reservoir for yellow fever now is in the primate populations in Central and South America. Mosquito goes, bites an infected monkey, bites a human, the human gets yellow fever. And in yellow fever, the symptoms are fever, chills, and headache, and usually followed by nausea and vomiting. Now, that's where it stops for some people, but for some people, the disease is more severe. It affects the liver, causing jaundice or a yellowing of the skin. That's why we call it yellow fever. And it can progress from there and cause the hemorrhagic fever, and the person dies. Now, dengue is a similar but milder viral disease that has been around in the Caribbean and Central and South America for quite a while, but it's currently spreading into the United States. Dengue causes usually a mild but highly painful disease that is characterized by fever, severe muscle and joint pain, and a rash. The joint pain leads to its alternate name of bone break fever. Most people get over it and they're just fine afterwards. Not fun, but you get over it. If you get it a second time, you can get dengue hemorrhagic fever, in which you have internal hemorrhaging and you die. What we believe is going on, because it's happening a second time, is antibodies against the initial dengue infection are combining with the antigens on the virus and depositing on the basement membranes of your capillaries, which leads to your immune system attacking that, causing rupture of the capillaries and causing you to die. So because of this, we haven't been able to come up with a vaccine for dengue, because if we vaccinate you, you don't get the milder, painful dengue fever. You get the dengue hemorrhagic fever and you die. So we're working on a way to get around that. So until then, the best thing we can do is control the vector, which is the mosquito. Now on to emerging viral hemorrhagic fevers. Now I'm going to combine Marburg and Ebola hemorrhagic fevers. They're both caused by filoviruses. They're filamentous long RNA viruses, and they occur sporadically, mainly in Central Africa. We haven't figured out the natural reservoir for this. Right now, the current favorite is fruit bats, but we're not positive. But what happens is it shows up as a fairly mild disease to start out with. You get headache and muscle pain, you just don't feel good, but after a few days the victim begins to have high fever and begins vomiting blood, and then blood comes from every opening. Now, the main difference between Marburg and Ebola is the mortality rate. Marburg has a much lower mortality rate. It's in about the 50% range. Ebola, the mortality rate is in the 90% range. So if you have to pick which one you're going to get, you want to get Marburg. There's no treatment for it right now. We do supportive therapy, try to keep the person from reaching the hemorrhagic phase where they're bleeding out. We also try to prevent spread. We don't know where it's coming from initially, but we do know that it can spread from person to person from bodily fluids such as saliva and vomit, diarrhea, and blood. Now, the last emerging one that I'm going to talk about is a hantavirus that has its natural reservoir in deer mice in the southwestern United States. Could be other areas, but that's where it's been popping up. When it jumps to people, usually through dried urine of rodents or dried droppings, we inhale the hantavirus and it causes severe pulmonary symptoms. Starts out as fever, body aches, the usual, and then it progresses to severe pneumonia and can progress from there to renal hemorrhagic fever, which leads to the death of the patient. When people potentially could come in contact with rodent droppings, say you're cleaning out an area where you've had a lot of mice, is to wear masks so that you're not breathing in the virus. Also, we are tracking the spread of the hantavirus through the rodent populations. So far in its march north, it's reached northern Utah, and it could be crossing into Idaho any day now. Now, you'll notice that I keep referring to it as hantavirus. When it was originally isolated in the mid-1990s, they called it the Four Corners virus because that's where disease was showing up initially. Well, they were afraid that it was going to affect tourism. So then they changed the name to the Morte Canyon virus, which I thought was a pretty cool name. For whatever reason, they've decided to call it the Sin Nombre virus. Until they decide, I'm going to keep calling it the hantavirus. So that's what you're going to see on the test. Now on to our lone protozoan disease. We're going to talk about malaria. Malaria has been a problem for about as long as we have recorded history. Even in the United States. We don't think about getting malaria in the United States, but it was a real problem, especially in the Mississippi River Valley. But once we took care of the mosquitoes, that took care of malaria. Well, it's not that easy in other areas. So let's talk about how mosquitoes pass the Plasmodium protozoa, which causes malaria. Malaria grows inside of the mosquitoes, and when the female mosquito bites an uninfected person, she passes the protozoa into the bloodstream, and then there it gets into human red blood cells, as you can see in this lovely scanning electron micrograph. And that's where the malaria protozoa likes to live in humans. It replicates within red blood cells, pops out, circulates in the blood, infects other red blood cells, and the cycle repeats. Well, your immune system sees it, if you want to think of it that way, when they're popping out of the red blood cells. And that's when your immune system attacks, and you have fever, chills, and then your immune system clears out the free malaria. Malaria has already infected other red blood cells. About 2 to 3 days later, it pops out again, and you have fever and chills again. That's why malaria has a tendency to have this cyclic clinical appearance. You start getting black urine. That's usually in the last stage of the disease. You know that the patient is about to die when they get black urine, and that's another name for malaria, is black water fever. Well, interesting thing, when you have the malaria parasite circulating within the patient's blood, they smell extra nummy to the mosquitoes. So the mosquitoes come and bite, get a blood meal that has these parasites, and malaria completes its life cycle. So we have some anti-malarial drugs that are pretty good. Unfortunately, Plasmodium has developed resistance to an awful lot of them. So we're constantly working on anti-protozoal drugs specifically for malaria. We're also working on mosquito abatement. Well, the problem is that, especially in Africa, the mosquitoes have become resistant to the insecticides. You just can't win. Mosquitoes have a tendency to like to bite humans at night when we're sleeping. So if you put a mosquito net around people, that can decrease their chances of getting malaria. Unfortunately, if you move in your sleep and a foot sticks out underneath the net, you get bit. It's frustrating. But malaria is on our list of diseases to wipe out eventually, and we're hopefully progressing toward that. Now on to our last systemic disease, which is a Helminthic disease, which is caused by a flatworm or fluke. Eggs are passed out of the urine and feces of infected humans, goes into the water where they infect freshwater snails. Then they pass out of the freshwater snails and they burrow into the skin of humans who are in the water and get into the blood. That's where we call it blood fluke. The adult male and female get together. The female permanently lives in a groove of the male, and they produce eggs, and the eggs leave in the urine and the feces. So the cycle is continued. Well, schistosomiasis is the second most debilitating or fatal disease after malaria in developing parts of the world. What happens is the adults, generally the immune system doesn't see them. They coat themselves in antigens that look like the tissue that they're in, which is generally in either the bladder or in the intestines. And they also change their antigens on a regular basis, so the immune system doesn't see them. What happens is, when the eggs do not pass out of the body, they become lodged in other tissues, and your immune system does see them and attacks them, causing long-term inflammation, which causes the disease. When it gets into the bladder, and we have these eggs embedded in the tissue of the bladder, it can cause bladder cancer. It can also get into the lungs and cause respiratory problems. If it gets into the brain and you have long-term inflammation of the brain, you have neurological symptoms. Treatment. We do have some anti-worm agents, but the best way is to prevent the disease. So wastewater treatment, if you treat your wastewater before it goes back into the rivers, streams, rice paddies, etc., then you prevent the eggs from going into the water and infecting snails. Now we also have snail control. We're less reluctant to do that with the snails because they're a part of the normal ecosystem. With mosquitoes, I'm sorry, there's very few things that can be said good about a mosquito, and so most people say, kill the mosquitoes. But with snails, we have a little harder time with it. But those are the two main ways that we prevent the disease. And if you prevent the disease, then you decrease its occurrence within the population. Well, that was quite a bit, wasn't it? Once again, I'm going to say my usual, go over this as many times as you need to. Make sure you write down your questions, take the troublesome topic survey so that we can discuss things that may be giving you some more problems in class and we can clear those up.